Hello and welcome to the Bible channel. In this video, we're looking at Jericho and specifically the walls of Jericho. Did the walls of Jericho really collapse? Or is this one of the Bible's most debated miracles? In this thought-provoking deep dive video, we examine the archaeological evidence from Jericho's ruins, historical records versus the biblical account, scholarly debates and Joshua's conquest, and Rahab's role and why it matters. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe and leave a comment in the comment section.
We move on to the fifth talk in our series on archaeology and the Bible. We last covered the encounter with Balaam as the children of Israel were camping in the plains of Moab just prior to them entering the promised land. The time now as they cross the river Jordan is 1406 BC. Immediately after crossing, we read in Joshua chapter 4 and verse 19, "The people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho." So it is the month of Nisan, the first month. And it is here at Gilgal that all the males were circumcised, as no one had been circumcised during the 40 years in the wilderness. We read of this in chapter 5 and verse 5 of Joshua. "Though all the people who came out had been circumcised, yet all the people who were born on the way in the wilderness after they had come out of Egypt had not been circumcised." Now at this point you may have in your head an old Sunday school image similar to this, where the children of Israel are marching around a classic medieval type castle. Large castle walls surrounding a city situated on a flat plain. But as we shall see, this is far from the truth, and a careful reading of Scripture will reveal the accuracy of what has been uncovered. Now, before we look more closely at Jericho, let's just look at some interesting detail regarding the information we are given about the drying up of the Jordan to enable the crossing to take place on dry ground. And we read of this in verse 17 of chapter 3. "Now the priests bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan." And in verse 15 and 16 we are told, "As soon as those bearing the ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam." And we can locate Adam, which is known today as Damiah, and it is found slightly south of Pethor, where we established that Balaam operated from, some 29 kilometers upstream from opposite Jericho. Zooming in, we get a slightly better view with Deir Allah in the north near the river Jabbok. And if we zoom in even closer, we can see Damiah or Adam located on the east side of the Jordan Valley, with the Jordan River, notice, running down the edge of the west side of the valley. We also have, as indicated, the Damiah Bridge just before the Jordan River. So if we were standing on the west side of this bridge, looking in an easterly direction, in the direction of Adam, this is the view we would have in this picture. Now, what is interesting about the description of how the Jordan River dried up is the way the Bible describes what happened. It says in Joshua 3 verse 16, "The waters above," so upstream of this point, "stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam." The language is clearly telling us that the river has somehow been dammed up, causing the water behind the dam to build up in a heap. Now, what we do know is that the Jordan River is located in the Rift Valley, which is an unstable region and prone to frequent earthquakes and landslides on those steep valley walls. In fact, there have been 6 well-known and major recorded mudslides in relatively recent history, notably in 1160, in 1267, 1546, 1834, 1906, and 1927 AD. And the 1267 mudslide was recorded by the Arab historian Nawari, and he writes that a large mound on the west side of the Jordan at Damiah fell into the river, damming it up. And he says no water flowed south from Damiah for 16 hours. In the most recent one that occurred in 1927, an earthquake caused a section of a cliff 150 feet high, so that's 46 meters high, to collapse into the Jordan near the ford at Damiah, and it cut off the flow of the Jordan for some 21 hours. And if you look closely at the west side of the valley wall, opposite Adam, you can see the curved scar left by a big landslip, and how the Jordan River has actually been pushed eastwards away from that west valley wall. And these mudslides have been known to stem the flow of the Jordan for periods of anything from 1 to 2 days. And this is more than enough time for the children of Israel to pass over in haste, as we read they did in Joshua chapter 4 and verse 10. If we take a look at a profile across this Jordan Valley in this area near Adam, we can quickly see the steep sides leading down to the valley floor, and how on the west side, where the river runs very close to the valley wall, a collapse and landslide can easily dam up the River Jordan. In this particular picture, at this point, we are looking here across the flat Jordan Valley to the west side, and we can see clear evidence of past landslides that have occurred and how these would have easily resulted in the damming of the Jordan, just as we are told in Scripture. Now, heading back to the actual crossing of the Jordan, we see how Israel moved from the plains of Moab west across the Jordan, and we can see the location of modern-day Jericho city. If we zoom into the city itself, we come across the archaeological site of the ancient city of Jericho, and it is known today as Tel es Sultan. Now, Israel at this point have encamped at Gilgal on the 10th day of Nisan after crossing over the Jordan. And so after circumcising all the males, we read that they keep the Passover on the 14th day of Nisan. And we pick this up in Joshua chapter 5 and verse 10. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. On the next day, this is now the 15th, we read in verse 11, and the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes, and parched grain. And this again tells us that this is harvest time, as they were able to gather and eat the produce of the land. They didn't have time to grow that in just 5 days after crossing the Jordan. They had to be able to go out there in harvest time and pick what they needed from the land. In addition, we can further confirm that this is harvest time. As the 2 spies were hidden amongst the flax Rahab was busy drying on her rooftop. And we see this in chapter 2 and verse 6. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with the stalks of flax that she had laid in order on the roof. Now we will come back a bit later as to why this information is so important. So looking now at this Tel es Sultan, the archaeological site of the ancient city of Jericho, we see this massive mound or tell with numerous scars of past digs and excavations. And from this we can very easily see that the city was built over the years as a typical mound-type city, as is seen in the numerous tells that have been uncovered throughout this region. This was the way the people at that time built their cities. So as I mentioned earlier, far different from our typical Sunday school medieval picture. Jericho would have actually looked something like this. Now, over the last century or so, there have been a number of major archaeological excavations. And what has been somewhat surprising is the vastly different dates that have been put forward as to when the city was destroyed. Way back in 1907 to 1909, Sellon and Watzinger put forward a destruction date at around 1550 BC. In his extensive excavations from 1930 to 1936, John Garstang concluded that Jericho was destroyed in and around 1400 BC. And a lot of his work was carried out in a residential area marked as Site A, located just west of the perennial spring that supplied the city's water and which now fills the modern reservoir. From the drawing, we can see that quite a significant portion of the tell was destroyed to make way for the modern road. Now, Garstang based his dating on imitation Cypriot pottery. And this is some of the pottery that was found by Garstang. And the pottery is quite distinctive, and it's decorated with red and black geometric patterns. And it was in use only in the 15th century BC. So in other words, from 1500 to 1400 BC. And this fits with the time of the Israelite conquest according to biblical chronology. Next up, we have Kathleen Kenyon, and her main excavation period carried out at Site B was from 1952 to 1958. And she put forward a destruction date at 1550 BC, some 150 years earlier than Garstang, and long before the date of the 1406 BC that we work out chronologically in the Bible. Now, Kenyon was known for her excellent fieldwork, especially in pioneering the process of stratified excavation. But she lacked proper training, background, and education, which may have led her to formulate unsubstantiated theories and conclusions. In addition, her explorations and digs took place after the establishment of Israel in 1948, and there was likely huge political pressure placed on her to put forward a date that pointed away from the biblical record. This suppression by the Jordanian government is continuing today, and new archaeological evidence is being buried if it is found to prove or agree with the biblical account. Archaeologists are under pressure to not rock the narrative if they want to be allowed to continue their work. Now, one of the key and most recognized methods used to date ancient ruined cities is to compare pottery pieces, which generally can be found from other more accurately known sites around the Mediterranean. And Kenyon had no training or experience in dating late Bronze Age pottery and made no reference to any proper analysis of pottery in her reports. In the 1990s, Dr. Bryant Wood, who had a PhD in late Bronze Age pottery, re-looked at the evidence that Garstang and Kenyon had published and found, and based upon the now well-recognized science of archaeology, concluded and dated the destruction of Jericho to be close to the biblical date of 1406 BC. Now, Garstang also discovered several scarabs and seals in a cemetery near Jericho, and these can be accurately dated and show that there was a presence here long after Kenyon said the city was destroyed and abandoned in 1550 BC. And so from left to right, we see a scarab of Hatshepsut, and we saw in part 2 that she was Pharaoh's daughter, and she reigned, co-ruled in fact, from 1485 to 1464 BC. Next in the middle, we have a scarab of Thutmoses III, and we saw again in part 2 that he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and he reigned part of his time from 1485, co-ruling with Hatshepsut, and he reigned all the way down to 1431 BC. And then the third item is the reverse side of a seal of Thutmoses III. And so if we actually look at the timeline with these various characters, these various pharaohs that existed, we can see that these would have been available, these scarabs and seals, they would have been available prior to 1406 BC. But for a date of 1550 BC, none of these people had been born yet. Now what we start to see in this sketch of the Jericho tell is two sets of walls. The outer wall, known as the revetment wall, and then above a rampart where an inner wall was built known as the upper city wall. And better seen in the sketch of what the city likely looked like. And this picture gives you an idea of what the cross-section would have actually looked like. And so the outer defense of the city consisted firstly of a stone revetment wall. So essentially this massive retaining wall, retaining the base of the tell. And at the base of this tell mound, this revetment wall we find rose to heights of 12 to 15 feet, so roughly around 4.5 meters. And to get an idea of the size of these revetment walls, this is a picture of Dr. Bryant Wood standing next to a portion of the excavated revetment wall. And we can just see the sheer size of this and what a formidable protection it was for that city. On top of this revetment wall was a mud brick parapet wall known as the lower outer city wall. And these were typically about 6 feet thick, so in other words, 2 meters thick, and around 20 to 26 feet high, or 6 to 8 meters high. So absolutely massive brick walls built on top of the revetment wall. Behind that lower city wall, we find the remains of houses located on that sloping rampart leading up to where the upper city walls were built. And these houses seem to be found on what must be described as the poorer area, closest, I guess, to the outside. And their walls were rather flimsy, generally only 1 brick thick, and they were also built right up against the mud brick lower city wall, that outer wall. And it's thought that Rahab, the prostitute who assisted Joshua's spies, might have lived in one of these right on the edge of the outer city wall. In this particular picture on the sloping rampart, so in other words, behind the lower outer city wall, we can see the remains of these cheaper houses or buildings. And if you look carefully, you can see that many of them have these walls that are only 1 brick thick. In this sketch from Sellon and Watzinger from their dig in 1907 to 1909. And when you look at it closely, you can see in their sketch the revetment wall, that darker wall at the bottom of the sketch, and then the remains of these cheaper houses found on that rampart. Now at the northern end of the site, all 3 archaeological expeditions to Jericho found remnants of a mud brick parapet wall, or that outer city wall, on top of the revetment wall. And at one point it was preserved still to a height of about 8 feet, so around about 2 meters or so. For the rest of the city, all of the mud brick parapet or outer wall was gone and had collapsed. And despite the fact that the area where the upper city walls once stood is also gone, there is evidence that this wall came tumbling down. In the words of the biblical account in Joshua, it fell down flat, as we see in verse 20 of Joshua chapter 6. Now, Kenyon made 3 cuts through the city's ramparts, one on the north, one on the west, and one on the south. And in all 3 cuts, she carried her excavation right down to the lower revetment wall. In the west cut, however, she went even beyond the revetment wall to the area outside the wall. And what Kenyon found outside the revetment wall in the west cut was quite astounding. There, outside the revetment wall, she found bricks from the lower outer city wall that had collapsed outwards. And these are depicted as the red section piled up against the black revetment wall. So in Kenyon's opinion, the pile of red bricks resting against the outer face of the revetment wall came from the collapsed outer city wall. And here's evidence that the walls of Jericho did indeed topple, as the Bible records it for us. The amount of bricks found was sufficient for an upper wall 2 meters wide and at least 3.7 meters high. And when the wall was deposited in this fashion after collapsing at the base of the tell, the collapsed mud bricks themselves formed a ready ramp for an attacker to climb up that very high revetment wall. And according to the biblical account, the Israelites who encircled the city, we read in verse 20 of chapter 6, went up into the city, every man straight before him. Note how the Bible accurately states that they went up into the city. And in this drawing, we start to get a better visual of how these red mud bricks would collapse outwards and help form the ramp, enabling the Israelites to easily move up past that imposing revetment wall, and then again at the top of the rampart, using the ramp created by the remains of the upper wall to gain access to the main city center. What Garstang and Kenyon also found revealed that the city was massively destroyed in a violent manner that left a layer of destruction debris 1 meter or more thick across the entire excavation area. Kenyon describes it as follows. Just listen to her words in her report. The destruction was complete. Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, household utensils. In most rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt, but the collapse of the walls of the eastern rooms seems to have taken place before they were affected by the fire. According to the Bible, after the Israelites gained access to the city, they, in verse 24 of Joshua chapter 6, burned the city with fire and everything in it. So the walls fell first, and only then afterwards was everything burnt. So the Bible tells us the walls collapsed first, in order obviously to allow access to the city. And only after that was the entire city burnt, exactly as discovered by Kenyon. And the most abundant item found in the destruction, apart from pottery, was grain. Both Garstang and Kenyon found large quantities of grain stored in the ground floor rooms of the houses. And this is unique and highly unusual. Why? Well, grain was a very valuable commodity in old times. The amount stored after harvest provided food until the next harvest. Grain was so valuable, in fact, that it was used as a medium of exchange or trade. The presence of these grain stores in the destroyed city is entirely consistent with the biblical account. The city did not fall as a result of a starvation siege, as was so common in those ancient times. If that had been the case, there would have been no food left. They would have eaten their way through all of their food during that siege. Instead, the Bible tells us in verse 15 and verse 20 of Joshua 6 that Jericho was destroyed after just 7 days. Now, successful attackers normally plundered valuable grain once they captured a city. This, of course, would be inconsistent with the grain that has been found here. But in the case of Jericho, the Israelites were told in verse 17 of Joshua 6 that the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. And they were commanded in verse 18, keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction. So the Israelites were forbidden to take any plunder from Jericho other than the valuables that would be used later for the temple. And so we read in verse 24, and they burned the city with fire and everything in it, including all the grain. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. Another point that can be drawn from the grain is that the city clearly fell shortly after harvest, in the spring of the year, as it was well stocked and stored with grain. And this is precisely when the Bible says the Israelites attacked Jericho. In Joshua 2 verse 6, Rahab was drying freshly harvested flax on the roof of her house. In Joshua 3 verse 15, the Israelites crossed the Jordan while it was in flood at harvest time, we're told. In Joshua 5 verse 10, they celebrated Passover just prior to attacking the city. And then in Joshua 5 verse 11, they were able to gather from the land produce to make unleavened cakes and parched grain the day after the Passover. There was clearly an abundance of food because it was harvest time. Now, when they excavated portions of the north end, they found that a portion of the mud brick wall on the top of the stone revetment or retaining wall had survived, demonstrating that the city wall did not fall in this area. However, as I've said before, nothing remains of the mud brick city wall, either the lower or the upper one, at any other points investigated, showing that it had collapsed everywhere else. Now, one of the most intriguing questions about the story in Joshua concerns the location of Rahab's house. We know her house had a roof exposed to the elements because she hid the spies under some flax that she was drying there. Also, according to the Bible, Rahab's house was incorporated into the outer wall. That was how she was able to let them down out of her window. And we read of this in Joshua 2 verse 15. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was built into the city wall, so that she lived in the wall. If these outer walls fell, how would her house have been spared? As you recall, the spies had instructed Rahab to bring her family into her house, and there they would be saved and rescued. And when the Israelites stormed the city, Rahab and her family were saved as promised. So this small portion of the wall that did not fall also had houses built up against that wall. It's quite possible that this is exactly where Rahab's house was located. So the outer city wall formed the back wall of these houses. And this depiction of the city, I think, accurately shows windows through those outer walls, exactly as would be necessary to be able to let the spies down. Now, what's also interesting about the discovery that just a small section of the northern walls were spared is when we look at the advice Rahab gave to the spies. You see, from this location on the north side of the city, it was only a short distance to the hills of the Judean wilderness where the spies hid for 3 days. We get some idea of this from this 3D map of the area and the hills to the immediate west of the city. So what does Rahab tell the two spies? Well, she says in verses 16 and verse 22 of Joshua 2, she said to them, "Go into the hills, or the pursuers will encounter you, and hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Then afterward, you may go your way." And so when we look at a Google map across the Jordan Valley, we quickly see how close Jericho is located to these hills. When the spies escaped, the pursuers would logically expect them to head back to the safety of the children of Israel across the Jordan and encamped in the plains of Moab, this red arrow route that I've indicated. But it was too far, and with no place to hide on the way, they would have been spotted by guards on the city walls, especially on the east side, which was facing the threat from across the Jordan, and then they would have been caught and captured. But by going west, the green arrow, instead of east, they had a very short distance to the hills in which we are told they hid for 3 days. No more than 800 meters and away from the direction the guards would have been looking. What must also be evident is that real estate values would be low here, since the houses were positioned on the embankment between the upper and lower city walls. Not the best place to live in a time of war. This area was no doubt the overflow from the upper city and was the poor part of town, perhaps even a bit of a slum district. Just the type of area you would expect a prostitute to have to live in. So our conclusion, was this destruction of Jericho carried out by the Israelites? Is the biblical account fact or fiction? Well, the correlation between the archaeological evidence and the biblical account seems far more than coincidental. Let's just look at the facts that have been uncovered. Firstly, the attack occurred in spring, just after harvest time, and we saw these well-stocked grain vessels that had been burnt inside the city. 2, the city was strongly fortified. There were these high double walls set on top of a massive revetment wall. Thirdly, the inhabitants had no opportunity to flee with their food. Just again, think of all those full grain vessels and pottery vessels that were found. Fourthly, the attack was remarkably quick and successful. There was no long siege, and again, proof given to us by the full grain vessels. Fifthly, the walls were leveled, possibly by an earthquake, and they fell outwards. 6, the fallen brick walls provided a perfect ramp to enable attackers to go up into the city. Point 7, the city was not plundered. Even large quantities of valuable food was left behind. Point 8, the city was totally destroyed and burned with a meter-high destruction layer. Point 9, a small portion of the outer city wall was preserved at the northern end with the remains of houses built into these walls. Point 10, the Judean hills west of the city are close enough to get to and hide as the spies would have done for 3 days. And in point 11, scarabs, seals, and pottery are dated to the biblical timeline of 1406 BC. This is a truly remarkable list of accurate detail and correlations between the biblical account and what various archaeologists have uncovered over the last 100 years or so. This level of detail cannot be merely coincidental. And bear in mind too, the biblical account was written nearly 3,500 years ago, long before these discoveries were made by these archaeologists.